So I'm very happy now to announce Tobias Meyer. He's the CEO of the DHL Group, just to give you an impression what this group is. If I got it right, it has 600,000 employees, 600,000, in more than 220 countries and territories. I even had no idea that there were more than 220 countries and territories. You see, it's really a giant. In some areas, at least in Germany, it's an incumbent giant. And it will be very interesting to hear from Mr. Meyer. Mr. Meyer has been on the board of the DHL Group since 2019. Since almost 1 year, since May 2023, he is the CEO of DHL Group, and it will be very interesting to hear that perspective from a real businessman here not only here in Germany, but throughout the world, the perspective of Mr. Meyer. Mr. Meyer, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Very glad to be here. I have to confess it feels a bit odd. I'm an engineer by education. I think I've never been in a room with so many people with a legal background, and somebody once told me that as a CEO, if you're in a big room with many lawyers and some journalists, the end is near. So I hope that this day still goes well. As Mr. Mundt already outlined, I'm representing a company that has a mission to basically facilitate global trade. That's the majority of what we do. That's why we're present in nearly all markets. That's why we're present in all tax havens as well, which sometimes provokes interesting questions. But we are there not for shady reasons, but to deliver cargo, to deliver documents to basically all places of this planet, to connect people and improve lives. That's how we define our mission. Before I have some specific comments on competition law, I would like to give a bit of background what it feels in international business these days. And I think we all recognize that the time of the pandemic, the Russian aggression on Ukraine, which required us to shut down a business with more than 6,000 people in Russia, the conflict in Israel and Gaza, the Red Sea issue, are quite big things to deal with. But I can also say that we as senior management have spent much less time on these issues than we have spent on increasing regulation and bureaucracy. And that is a deep concern for us, that there is and seems to be an increasing loss of focus, a loss of focus on what matters for the world, for Europe, for Germany, that the increasing bureaucracy is a hurdle to economic growth, and economic growth is needed to spend money on the transformation towards renewable energies, to spend on defense, security, education. It's taxes that need to be paid and created. And an hour spent on bureaucracy is an hour less spent on looking after our people, on serving our customers, on thinking through innovations, on thinking about entering and growing in new markets. And I think that is important to recognize. And I know that probably businessmen have always complained about some form of regulation and bureaucracy, but we are at a different point. And yes, I listen to what Minister Buschmann is saying and the efforts taken to reduce some of that, but I can assure you what will be added this year is at least 5 times as much in Europe than what is taken away. That's the reality as well. So what does it feel? And what is it really that we are complaining about? It is things like the EU taxonomy and the European sustainability reporting standards. Both are monsters in scale and in scope, and their broadness kills their effectiveness. And I want to give you some concrete examples of that. In the EU taxonomy, there is the do no other significant harm rule, which I think is a perfect example for the lack and loss of focus, because it's trying to incorporate everything and everywhere into something that really doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. So if we take delivery of an electric vehicle, we said such is a great thing because it doesn't produce carbon. It should be categorized as compliant from an EU taxonomy perspective. However, if you take delivery with winter tires, those winter tires do significant harm because of the wear they create, plastic particles, and the noise they produce. So the entire investment is not compliant to the EU taxonomy anymore. Does that make sense? Should we take delivery only with summer tires and then change to winter tires later? That's what we practically do to categorize that investment. And I'm always told, submit those examples so that we can change it. That's not the problem, because this is everywhere on this type of legislation. If you look at the EU sustainability reporting standards, a similar thing occurs, because that includes our businesses also in Fiji, in Mexico, in Panama, everywhere, where we as businesses now have to establish European standards. And I understand the European frustration of not being able to move in multilateral situation, to move things in the International Labour Organization, for instance, but we do not agree that it's the right approach to push European standards and European morale through business means. If we build a carbon neutral building in Mexico, it will only be classified if also the toilets apply to European water saving standards. If we go to Argentina to report going forward on our workforce structure and what we do for people with disabilities, we have to explain to our Argentinian colleagues that how they do things so far, that categorization doesn't work. It has to be European standards. They have to change, or I have to do double effort to apply standards so that we as a European hosted company can continue to report on our global activities. And it is not easy to explain to somebody in Fiji why we have to do that. So next to that bureaucratic effort, I'm really deeply concerned about this extraterritorial reach of regulation. The extraterritorial reach where European standards are applied globally. We understand that the European has certain interest, the European Union. And I also understand, to say that explicitly, that mechanisms like the carbon border adjustment mechanism are needed. It's very regrettable that they're needed, but it is unrealistic to hope that the world would agree on a common price of carbon. However, in such a situation, we should do everything to avoid other distractions and hurdles for global trade and global cooperation. And this is what we continue to do in Europe and in Germany. In Germany, we already have a Supply Chain Due Diligence Act that basically imposes some of those rules also on our suppliers globally. And as you are perfectly aware, on the European level, we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is under discussion, which again does exactly that. And it is painful to see the feedback of some of our colleagues and business partners in countries around the world when we have to push those topics. Europe represents 5% of the world's population. It's not the majority, it's 5%. And some of our business partners around the world don't want to be told anymore by those 5% on what to do. I think that is something that is increasingly becoming a problem for European businesses to be able to operate in those countries. And also in the small world of our postal business, we are still the universal postal service provider for Germany. That's the origin of our company. We do this since about 530 years in different ways. And in 1874, nations came together and founded the UPU, the Universal Postal Union, which, to my knowledge, is also the longest multilateral contract that is still in existence. Now, if you look at the import control system too, which we all understand is a EU requirement and has good reasons. But I think the EU wasn't even aware that it violates the UPU Treaty, because the UPU Treaty guarantees all nations free transit of postal shipments without interference. And it was only at the UPU Congress in Riyadh when this came up, and nobody was really apologetic about that. It was just accepted that we have good reasons to do what we think is right. So this is something that really concerns us, and it also has implications in other areas. Decarbonization is very close to our heart. It's very important for our business. We are a big emitter of carbon. Our company emits roughly the emissions of Denmark, about 33 million tons. So we take this serious, and we would like to do more. But if you look between the EU emission standards and limits for manufacturers, the quotas on fuel, the roll toll regulation, the real-life constraints, particularly of restrictions to the grid for electricity, there isn't much left that you can do that is now economically viable, at least close to economically viable, and under those registrations and regulations feasible. So our big concern, particularly when it comes to the decarbonization of heavy trucks, smaller vehicles is done, that's electric, that's not a big problem, but the bigger emitters is trucks. There isn't much at the moment we can do, because some of the technology, for instance, a hybrid vehicle with a diesel-electric generator on a battery-electric vehicle, is de facto not possible under this regulation, and this harms progress. So coming to competition law, 5 short points. On merger control, on overlapping competencies, on the bias towards traditional markets, on big tech, much was already said, and also the recognition of efforts in this area of big tech. So on merger control, we have to really say that it has become increasingly difficult to do bigger deals with bigger companies. And we understand, obviously, concerns in markets that are impacted by this. But to give you one concrete example, again, we did a joint venture with Saudi Aramco, energy producer in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And this is about procurement and logistics services in that space. And we don't have much overlap. We are a logistics company, they are an energy company. It has operations, this JV, initially only in the kingdom. But yet you go through a lot of proceedings. And the last proceeding that we waited for was Morocco, which honestly, I still struggle to see where this has any impact. So focusing those proceedings on mergers that impact the given jurisdictions, also using concentrated proceedings as we have it in the EU, also in Africa, would really help us. And then for those agencies in countries that are not really impacted to also rely and trust on the common ground that you have with the authorities in countries that are impacted and do a thorough investigation. On overlapping responsibilities and competencies, I think this does create an issue in both ways. If it's not clear who's responsible, you have wide gaps, but it also creates definitely legal uncertainties if those overlaps exist. And I think there are many proceedings where you ask yourself, was it intended that the Bundeskartellamt, for instance, is getting after Facebook to comply with data protection, or the EU Commission is going after tax gifts? Wouldn't it be better to have clearer and better legislation in the first place to clarify those things and who's responsible? And also in the new draft of the postal law that is currently discussed here in Germany, we actually see a widening an explicit widening of those overlaps, as now the Federal Network Agency has greater competencies to regulate also on competition aspects, and also gets authorities to investigate what currently customs does to secure that labor practices in the industries, which is definitely a concern, don't get me wrong. But now we have two agencies that look after that, and this could have been avoided. We also see in the area of price regulations that we now have three different standards, one coming from general competition law, one from the sectorial competition law, and then a new rule that is introduced, which is to further competition, so that this rule says that the price needs to be set to continue to enhance competition, that it is kind of congruent with other prices that we use. So you have three standards, and everybody knows that on a given day, it will never come out to be the same figure. So it's already clearly written on the wall that there are going to be legal proceedings around those questions. The stricter regulation of traditional markets is also something that we observe. Some of you spend a lot of time on what's shrinking and dying because you know it well. Our mail business is such an example. There seems to be a certain tendency to spend time on what's most familiar, even though if you really look in the mirror, you know that it's not going to make a big difference. We spend time on markets as small as 50 million euros, the national journal distribution market, for instance, so a sub market of the mail market overall, has been such a market where discussions have been going on whether we are dominant. And we do think that more attention is needed and more of the resources, the limited resources that you have as agencies on the big topics, on the growing topics that really make a difference. Which brings me exactly to big tech, which is also a concern for us as a more traditional business, as a service provisionist that uses big tech to a great extent. And we do see that on balance, there have been less checks than in some of our traditional markets, even though we positively recognize, obviously, that the attention has been massively growing. And I think we all recognize why that is needed, because those digital markets have unique economies of scale that you do not have in physical businesses, and the ability with platform business models to envelop neighboring markets. And this is definitely a concern to us because we are present on some of these neighboring markets. If you think about online sales platforms, the selection of the carrier that delivers those shipments is one of those neighboring markets. We do see, obviously, the activity that is going on, and just to go back in time, the European Commission fought against Microsoft first to ensure there were competing internet browsers, then to ensure there were still competing music players, and more recently on competing video and conference software. But if you really ask yourself now, who in the room would use or remember a music player that is not Apple or Microsoft? I think we would all recognize that that is really not much the case. And similarly, the Bundeskartellamt got after Amazon in 2019 and I think has achieved improvements for marketplace sellers, but it hasn't really led to contestability of that strong presence, that grab on the consumer and the ability to steer in neighboring markets, also in neighboring logistics markets. So we would very much agree that continued innovation through competition and including the contestability of a player's position in digital markets is crucial for any economy and definitely also for the European economy. And we appreciate the many efforts that have been taken recently in that regard, including, and it was mentioned earlier, Germany's effort with the extension of the antitrust law, paragraph 19a, which I think was a positive step by legislators, but we still have to see the full application. The intent to categorize a business with paramount significance and then also use the tool of prohibition decisions has not yet been used. We were also encouraged by the EU, using more the traditional toolkit of Article 102, to conclude a settlement with Amazon in 2022 that gives freer choice and limits self-preference. And we're definitely also looking forward to the application of the Digital Markets Act, and that concept seems to be very promising to us, to have more a reliance on self-fulfilling prohibitions and obligations for big tech companies. It is an area that is definitely of great concern for European business. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, let me recognize that to a great extent, the well-being and the competitiveness of markets is in your capable hands. And please allow me to leave you with a thought and the plea: focus on what matters. Focus on what matters. Decarbonization matters, digitalization matters, economic growth matters to be able to afford security, defense, education, social welfare. It does matter, it is needed that an economy thrive and growth, also to produce tax returns. And in Europe and in Germany, we definitely need that. And please also recognize and spend time on those forward-looking topics, particularly in the area of digitalization. And please avoid creating additional bureaucracy. Thank you very much.
Haben Sie ein Mikrofon? Do we have a microphone? A hand microphone? Please take your seat. Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer, also for these critical words.
It was just encouragement.
Yeah, I mean, we are doing a case with regard to the mail service, and so maybe a small market, but sometimes you have to look at these markets as well. But I want to start with another question. You talked about bureaucracy. The president of the German Association of Hospitals, Mr. Gerald Gass, he just said if we were able to reduce bureaucracy to a significant extent, we could all of a sudden, without doing anything else, have 30,000 additional doctors in Germany and 70,000 additional nurses in Germany, because this is the amount of hours that corresponds that these people have to deal with bureaucracy instead of being there for patients. So the big question is, Mrs. von der Leyen has announced that if she's going to be president of the European Commission once more, she's going to reduce bureaucracy through EU law by at least 25%. Some CEOs said that is very nice, but during her tenure, the bureaucracy has risen for more than 50%. So 25% is a good point to start from, but this is not the end of the tale. So my question is, bureaucracy and the decrease of bureaucracy is extremely difficult, because for every single rule there has been a good reason. And if you abolish that, you have to say that reason is obsolete, it's not in place anymore. Do you think that policy has the power to do that?
Well, I do think we must, because our citizens look ultimately at the success of our political and economic system. And this is why this is of really deep concern. They do see that other parts of the world are able to deal with challenges better. I certainly have my reservation with regards to the political system in China, but it has brought more people out of poverty than any other system. And I do think we need to recognize that what our citizens value is not necessarily what is discussed here in Berlin or in Brussels, where everybody comes with their topic. It is the need to focus. It is the need to focus on what matters. What matters to people that live in a village where you have 50% of right-wing voters is healthcare, education, a reasonable tax rate. For some, decarbonization matters, for others it don't. I think decarbonization is such a big topic for mankind that we, whether there's broad agreement or not, we need to move on it. But we need to have the ability in democracies to focus again on those topics. And it goes from the very top. If you think back in 2000, we had the Millennium Goals. Those were 8. And they were actually pretty specific and pretty good. Now we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals with a host of sub-goals that nobody in the room could reproduce. And some of those are so broad that you can put nearly everything under it. And this is, I think, a systemic problem that we have more and more focus of those things that somebody, rightly says it also, and somebody should have a thought, but we are distracted from what really matters to people. And this will become a big problem.
Yeah, we will see how far we will get with that. There's one question I must ask Mr. Meyer. Amazon is one of DHL's major package customers. It is also increasingly developing its own logistics. So it is growing into a position where it is a real competitor to the DHL Group. So can you say a few words on what is your relationship with Amazon, and
we switch off the camera.
And maybe a bit of a provocative question. We are in the middle of developing some reform of the postal law, and there are some provisions that might be read as some protection for DHL in this sense. Is that the natural reaction of a legislator, that if an incumbent like Deutsche Post or DHL Group, at least in Germany, is subject to real competition, we must do something about it by the law? A bit provocative.
Oh, that's
not
okay.
inspired, maybe not even inspired by you, but maybe it's a natural instinct of a German legislator.
No, I don't think it is, and you can answer a question in a minute with regards to this. I think the problem there is a different one. This is a shrinking market that will not attract a lot of investments by others anymore. And it's a bit, I would put it the other way around, it's a German obsession to think that this will not become a natural monopoly. Tell me one market in the world where competition in the mail market has led to a good outcome. Tell me one. The United States has never privatized the sector. The UK is a pretty disaster. Yeah? So there is just not in this market, there isn't a single example. And I'm not saying that it was wrong to try that in the 90s, because at that time that market was still growing. But now it's shrinking. It has significant economies of scale. You can make this unattractive for us, then we'll exit it at some point. And then the state needs to sort out how to either serve the customers that still want it. There's EU regulation that requires the Federal Republic of Germany provide that service to its citizens, tax-free, by the way, which is another debate that we have in Germany, right, about this tax-free. Please read the European Code. It's quite instructive on the matter. But we need to recognize that in this market, it has reached a phase where this competition will not heal it, and you create another problem that traditional voters want this type of service. So if we are not supposed to do it, find another way to do it. But it hasn't really worked. There isn't a single example, and I've looked, be sure, also around us, right? You can just go through the countries around us and ask yourself, where has this worked? Where has it led to better quality? Especially because that's also a discussion that we have in Germany. Is the quality good enough? I have to tell you, the quality has its price. So for a business that is listed, that has other things to do as well, we can allocate capital elsewhere. So coming back to Amazon, this is obviously a different situation. The parcel market is a growing market. It attracts investment. I think we've a bit passed the phase now during Corona, and I also understand deeply why Amazon went into logistics. I think that's important sometimes to revisit. When did they start? They had a very bad experience with UPS and FedEx and the United States Postal Service in the winter of 2012 and 2014 in the US, where a lot of packages that were meant to be under the Christmas tree didn't arrive. So that was the big push when Jeff Bezos says, you know, I'm obsessed by customer value proposition, so if they can't do it, I do it. And they did a pretty good job in some aspects. I think that is the type of competition we like. You know, I discuss with these guys, you know, price is always difficult. Yeah, it's okay, right? I mean, we tell you this is the price. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. And they tell us, well, then we actually do. And then at some point you find an agreement. That's how it typically goes. But they also did push some really good innovations. You know, packageless return is such an innovation which I resisted for a long time. And we said, okay, we do it for you because we can see the customer value proposition. And I think it makes consumers' life a little bit easier. So it's one of those examples. But obviously we are concerned if suddenly our parcel lockers are not available on their website anymore. Yeah? Consumers suddenly can't choose that anymore. Now, that is always a technical glitch, could be an explanation, maybe there are other explanations, I don't know. But so these type of behaviors, I think it's right that authorities look at that.
Yeah, one should know that Amazon stands for 50% of online commerce in Germany, at least, and it has an important role here. Mr. Meyer, this is your stage. A very last question. How do you see the competitive landscape in Europe for companies, in Germany, in Europe, if you look at the world, and all the turmoil also that we are talking about here? What is your view on that?
So what for us is more concerning than the weakness in Europe is the stance of the Middle East, the stance of Latin America, the stance of Africa as it relates to its relation to Europe versus China. That is something that concerns us, and we do see a very significant shift that should also worry people here in Europe more than it actually does. People find it difficult to deal with us, and they find it easier to deal with China. And the progress, the influence that China has on these economies should not be underestimated. If you look what cars are on the road in Dubai, where it was just this week, it has changed notably. So I think it's time to just recognize that shift. And obviously the geopolitical conflicts don't help at all in that regard. So not only as a businessman and as a natural interest to see global trade flourishing, I think it's important for us to not only say to people what we don't like and whom we not like to deal with, but also to still try to build bridges wherever this is possible. And I know that's difficult. I don't want to have the job of some politicians either. But I think we need to make a greater effort to see what is common interest and what is for the common good. And just one reminder on that, because that's also not often discussed. On the renewable side, and starting to really make a difference in avoiding carbon, China has made massive steps. China built more renewable energy last year than the whole Western world together. And I think that is one of those areas where I think we have a critical common interest to make sure we get this global problem for mankind under control, and we must.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tobias Meyer, thank you very much.